Okay, so we're talking today about intelligent automation, and for many people, myself included, it might seem something of a no-brainer for organizations. It has major obvious benefits, but quite a lot of companies seem to be reluctant to go down that path. And I'm just wondering if you've got any sort of ideas or anecdotally or evidence that you've bumped into as to some of those reasons that are blocking them, the reasons that might trigger the sort of reluctance to deploy automation.
It's one of the great ironies of the field of automation that the people who stand to benefit the most from automation are the ones who have the least amount of time to implement it. So I'd say part of that reluctance is simply due to a lack of bandwidth. Um, Another reason, which I refer to often on my podcast, is robophobia, the fear of being automated out of a job. I can tell you from personal experience, though, having been around automation for a number of years, I don't know of anybody who's ever lost their job to automation. I know of lots of people whose jobs have changed, primarily for the better, because automation eliminated the robotic, laborious, repetitive stuff that they secretly despise doing anyways. Um, Maybe another tranche of reluctance comes from a minority demographic in IT operations that just has a preference for doing things the hard way. These are people who like to roll up their sleeves and get down and dirty with the bits and bytes, and they don't really like things being simplified for them. So those have been really the primary reasons I've seen for that reluctance.
Okay, and in terms of the consequences of if they're reluctant, therefore they sort of shy away from automation. The downsides from not doing it, maybe we can have a little look at those. And perhaps the first obvious point to start is sort of inefficiencies and a lack of speed. I guess speed both with your infrastructure, but also just the company and generally its ability to move, its agility to change. Maybe as we've seen during the pandemic, things like that.
Absolutely. If you hesitate to automate, you're condemning your employees to manual, robotic like labor. And that could ultimately have repercussions on recruiting efforts, particularly in attracting millennials and Gen Z who are now entering the labor pool in growing numbers. Um, it's also difficult to scale up processes that are reliant on people for the simple reason that people don't scale very well. So you're going to find that it may be difficult without automation to do some of the things that your competitors are doing. And this inefficiency from a lack of automation will eventually ripple out to customers and partners and begin affecting their interests, which could lead to some undesirable outcomes.
And I'm guessing as well. I mean, human error is a classic sort of problem within any organization, and the theory is that automation eliminates a lot of that. Although I suppose at some stage a human has to give the raw information to the automation. But what I guess the point is, human error is another major problem. If you don't automate tasks, you are opening yourself up to people, as you say, it's a repetitive task, and therefore it's very boring. They don't give it the attention it deserves, and all of a sudden something's gone badly wrong.
Absolutely. As the saying goes, to err is human, but to really foul things up, you need a computer. And when you combine the two, human error with computers, you can achieve catastrophic disruptions of really epic proportion. One that comes to mind is the massive AWS outage that Amazon experienced, I think, in early 2017 due to human error. I recently read that the Uptime Institute estimated that human error was behind about 70% of all the problems that plague data centers today. 70%. If you think about that, in 70% of cases, all it took to bring down today's most powerful high tech to its knees was just one person making an honest mistake. I mean, who among us hasn't accidentally hit the reply all button and sent something to everybody in the entire company when we didn't mean to? I mean, mistakes happen, and it happens to people in data centers no less frequently than the rest of us. So with automation, you eliminate the potential for human error without eliminating the human. And it's exactly the same logic behind self-driving vehicles. It was, I think, McKinsey that published a report that at least 90% of all traffic accidents were due to human error. So that's why there's a push towards widespread use of autonomous vehicles, which could eliminate 90% of all auto accidents, at least in the US. And I think their estimate was that that would prevent something like 200 billion in annual damages and health costs, not to mention save thousands of lives. So automation eliminates a lot of errors.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier a bit about the competitive edge or lack of if you don't have automation. So, I guess again we've seen these sort of web companies arrive and disrupt markets, and I guess automation is one of their key advantages. So, is it almost a question you know, even if you don't want to automate for whatever reason, you've got to, because if you don't, you are going to get left behind as an organization in the market.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most potentially painful consequence of all from not automating. Because, once organizations begin automating, becoming more efficient, becoming more scalable, they can attain an unfair competitive advantage. And if their head start on automation is significant, then their lead can easily end up being insurmountable. So I'd say that if you're a business leader still pondering whether automation is right for your enterprise, I can virtually guarantee you that one or more of your competitors is already well past making that decision for their organization, and they're using automation to gain a competitive advantage on you right now.
And I'm guessing that manifests itself maybe most obviously in sort of innovate, or the ability to innovate. Again, if automation can speed up that process, you can bring a new application, customer facing product, whatever it is, to market much more quickly than with the human process. Is that where we're looking at?
Absolutely. Automation eliminates a lot of the toil in an information worker's daily routine, and that frees them up to think about and work on higher level, more strategic problems. And so when you create the space to allow people to think at higher levels, you're enabling an opportunity for them to think more about innovating. Um, as I mentioned, a large chunk of new hires are younger employees, like millennials, of course, but also early members of the next demographic wave, often referred to as Gen Z. These generations have been raised on Facebook and mobile apps, and they generally prefer interfacing with technology rather than people. We know that empirically because just about anywhere you look, young people are staring into some kind of screen. So if you use automation to create an environment of innovation, you're far more likely to attract the best and the brightest from these younger generations who have no desire to do things the old fashioned way by pushing paper on a desk. So, more automation leads to more innovation, which could also lead to a competitive advantage in recruiting.
Okay, so we've sort of looked at the downside of not automating in terms of people then who are comfortable or want to embark on that intelligent automation journey. Maybe it's a bit of an open-ended question, but can you give some advice as to how and where to start with that process?
I would start by establishing an automation center of excellence, or a COE. Just about every automation vendor recommends it. I've been in the automation space for many years, and the single biggest differentiator I've seen between clients who've achieved moderate success and those who achieved off the charts success with automation is that the latter had established an automation center of excellence. And the reason why is because when you have a COE, you have a place that articulates a unifying vision for everyone in the organization involved in automation. They provide support and guidance for automation from a single source by defining standards, publishing best practices, tips and tricks, things of that nature. Um, the COE is a repository of domain expertise in automation. It's a storehouse of shared learning. It's a place that fosters an exchange of knowledge internally. The COE is also responsible for doing things like mean time to resolution analysis, ROI calculations, all sorts of other quantifying measurements that definitively show automation's benefits to an organization. And it fulfills a governance role that ensures that automation initiatives remain in alignment with business goals. So, by far and away, the best place for an organization to begin with automation is by establishing a COE.
Okay, and in terms of if there's a single biggest thing organizations can do to ensure the success of an intelligent automation, is that the same? Is it again that center of excellence, or is there another sort of major important thing that they need to do to ensure success of an automation project?
Yeah, it's actually something else, and it's an obvious one, but surprisingly one that falls through the cracks way too often. You must you must secure senior level executive buy-in. If you don't get the CEO, CIO, CTO, or the board to mandate automation for the enterprise, that can often be the biggest impediment to achieving automation success. On the other hand, I've seen it many times that when senior executives and or the board are all singing from the same page of their hymnal, your automation initiative is probably 50% on its way to succeeding.
Okay, and then in terms of the sort of the automation landscape, so in the company, they've clearly got vast amounts of applications, infrastructure. They're looking at it all, thinking intelligent automation, scratching their heads and going, how do I work out where to, because presumably it's not a good idea to throw a load of automation at everything to start with. So how do you pick the applications, the projects to start with, and then grow out in the business?
It just so happens I just finished writing a white paper on IT automation POC best practices that includes an entire section on how to pick processes to automate. To summarize, you need to do both a quantitative as well as a qualitative assessment of the processes you think might be the best candidates for automation. So the place to start is you must document. You must document your current process as it exists today, with all of its manual elements. And you must also document how that process will look in the future once it's fully or even at least partially automated. Now, very importantly, there's two levels of future process documentation, boringly called level one and level two. Level one is simply taking your existing process and documenting what it will look like with the exact same set of steps, but all of them automated. And level two of a future process is where you're completely re-engineering the process to take advantage of unique benefits that automation can provide, which might mean adding some tasks to a process that don't currently exist. As an example, let's say that you want to automate the password reset process. Instead of a user calling or emailing the help desk, in the future, they'll be able to interface with a chatbot and reset their password securely in a self-service fashion. So you're adding the chatbot, something that doesn't exist right now. So once you've documented for the current process as it is now and the future process as it will look with automation, you need to tap into your cost accounting team or whatever the appropriate function is in your enterprise and quantify how much time a process takes to complete and what that's costing the enterprise today. And you need to break it down by task within that process. So then you would also apply the same cost accounting techniques to the future process documentation. That way you can do an apples to apples comparison and generate a quantitative difference in cost and time savings. So that's quantitative. On the qualitative side, you have to think about things like driving operational efficiency and avoiding downtime or preventing SLA breaches. So a qualifying or a qualitative metric for driving operational efficiency might be something like, is the process run frequently and or time consuming? A qualitative metric for avoiding downtime or preventing SLA breaches might be something like, is this process mission critical? You must then, for your own organization, determine what score to assign to these qualitative metrics based on what's important to your enterprise. And every enterprise must come up with their own unique weighted score for qualitative criteria because there's no one size fits all scoring mechanism involved here. So you apply quantitative criteria and qualitative criteria, you score it for every single process candidate, and then you do this for all your process candidates and you put the results in a spreadsheet. And at that point, it becomes a pretty easy task of simply sorting from highest to lowest score to determine which processes would be the best candidates for automation in your organization.
Okay, and in terms of that actual practicality, is it, in your experience, very obvious for the vast majority of organizations, there'll be two or three clear applications, processes that are the candidates, or is there maybe the potential that you'll end up with a whole load of them because you either haven't carried out the process correctly, or it just ends up being, 10 or a dozen that seem to be equally important to the organization, or is it, as I say, tend to be obvious that there's two or three main ones to start with?
There's usually a few obvious ones. Keep in mind that in our experience, about 80 to 85% of tasks in IT operations, processes in IT operations, are good candidates for automation, simply because they're usually very structured, repeatable, predictable, and those are the criteria that make for good processes for automation. Um, so you'll start with some obvious ones, and we maintain on our website a list of the 10 most popular processes for automation. But it's something that each organization has to determine for itself.
Sure. Okay. And then we get on to the deployment stage. So you deploy those solutions, and presumably it's quite important to not just sort of deploy them, then walk away, but monitoring them to check that they are actually doing what you thought they were going to be doing is quite an important part of the process.
Oh yeah, and this is where the center of excellence comes into play again. The COE can track the performance of your automated workflow and benchmark it against other workflows that it's tracking elsewhere in the enterprise. This is also where what I call the stepladder effect comes into play. When you stand on a stepladder, you can see things a bit differently than from ground level. And it's exactly the same with automation. Once your process is automated, you'll suddenly start to get new ideas on how to take it further, how to drive more efficiency, how to consider doing things that were never part of the discussion before. So basically, you initiate a cycle of continuous improvement.
And alongside that sort of monitoring, I guess the personnel involved, I mean, potentially there's some training required up front to do with depending on the kind of automation applications being implemented. But also, again, it's important that that's a continue. You don't just train them on day one, set them off, but you need to be aware that they might need to update those skills on regular intervals, depending on what kind of automation is carrying on. Is that right?
You bet. We recommend to all of our customers that they attend the Yehu Automation Academy. It's 39 courses. It's free, and it shows you a number of different aspects of automating and bringing automation into an enterprise. And once the automation cycle begins, success begets success. As a team builds and deploys successful automation workflows, they gain the confidence to start exploring other things to automate. So they gain insight and expertise on integrating different systems and tools and environments in order to automate processes that touch multiple platforms. And at that point, automation becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of innovation for your organization. And it helps if the tool that you're using does not require a lot of training, so that it makes it easy for more people to get involved.
Okay, and maybe as we sort of draw to a close, we've talked about sort of intelligent automation in general terms, but if we could maybe bring it closer to the AIOPS sort of focus of the event. So for people who are going down the AIOPS route, how important is it that alongside that they have a program of intelligent automation? Are the two sort of inextricably linked, or can you do AIOPS without intelligent automation, or can you have intelligent automation and not do AIOPS? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Yes, the two can be standalone, but that's not what was intended, I think, when Gartner coined the term AIOps. And speaking of Gartner, they had put out a circular graphic not long ago that succinctly depicted their view of AIOps, which encompassed three phases, which they labeled observing, engaging, and acting. And that last one, acting, is automation. So automation, in conjunction with the insights gained from observing and engaging, is needed to complete the full circle of AI ops for delivering the ability to fix disruptions before they occur, right? That's one of the big promises of AI ops. So in order to have that sort of self-healing data center of the future that AI ops promises, you have to have automation. Observing and engaging alone are not enough.
Okay, and maybe just finally, if you got any one or two thoughts as to, again, folks who are looking intelligent, whether they've looked at intelligent automation and it hasn't delivered what they maybe thought it was, or back to where we started, people that so far have found reasons not to automate. What one or two things would you sort of use to sell automation to folks, who are maybe a bit skeptical or disappointed in their experience so far?
Well, I would ask to review what happened that might have gone wrong the first time. Let's do a forensic analysis first off. But if you haven't gotten to that stage, but you've heard about disappointment elsewhere, I think the first thing you need to do is set proper expectations and start small. Years ago when I was in college, I took a computer science class, and the introduction to the class was, how do you cook an elephant? You don't have a skillet big enough to cook the entire elephant. You got to cut it into pieces and do it one small piece at a time. Just exactly the same with automating anything in IT operations. You got to take it one piece at a time. So that would be my suggestion with regards to people considering it, but who have been maybe reluctant, or have heard something from elsewhere that it wasn't as effective as it's been touted. There's also one other thing I'd like to point out that I think is an important thing to remember. Scripting does not equal automation, contrary to what you may have heard from some AI ops vendors. The idea behind automation is roughly similar to the idea behind cars having an automatic transmission instead of a stick shift. Not everybody can drive a car with a stick shift. It's more difficult for many. It requires additional driving skills. It increases the complexity of the product, in this case, the automobile. But just about everybody can drive a car with an automatic transmission. You just get in the car, you start it, you decide if you want to go forwards or backwards by putting it in drive or reverse, and then you step on the gas. It's simple. So that's exactly the same idea with automation. Anybody should be able to create an automated workflow, and they should be able to do so without scripting or programming or coding skills of any kind whatsoever. And by democratizing automation for the masses, that means you make it accessible to anyone. And that in turn lowers its costs for organizations who won't need expensive IT specialists to enjoy automation's many benefits. And there are many of them.
Okay, that's great. I mean, it's been lovely to chat to you today, Guy. So thanks indeed for your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.